The town of Harlan Creek, Texas had opinions about most things. About the weather, about the price of grain, about whose cattle were grazing too close to whose fence line. But the opinion it held most tightly, the one it had carried for 11 years without once loosening its grip, was about the woman who lived in the small white house at the end of Sycamore Road. They had a name for her that was not her name. They had a story about her that was not her story. And for 11 years that woman had walked down the main street of Harlan Creek with her chin up and her eyes forward, and she had absorbed every whisper and every turned shoulder and every door that went quiet when she walked through it. She had survived all of it. And then one Sunday morning in the spring of 1894, a cowboy stood up in the middle of the Harlan Creek town meeting and said 5 words that nobody in that room was prepared for. 5 words that rewrote 11 years of a story that had never been true to begin with. He said, "I will marry her today." The room went silent. And then it went everything else. Stay with me, because what happened next is not the story you think it is. And the woman at the center of it, the one they had spent 11 years trying to reduce to a rumor, is someone you are going to remember for a very long time after this video is over. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened in that meeting room on that Sunday morning, you need to understand 3 things. You need to understand who this woman was and what the town of Harlan Creek had decided to believe about her. You need to understand who this cowboy was and what it cost him to stand up in that room and say what he said. And you need to understand what secret had been living underneath the surface of Harlan Creek for 11 years that made those 5 words land with the force of something that had been held underwater for a very long time, finally breaking the surface. 3 questions are going to drive this story from beginning to end. The first is this: what did Harlan Creek believe about this woman, and why did they believe it so completely for so long? The second is this: what did this cowboy know that nobody else in that room was willing to say out loud? And the third, the one that is going to keep you here until the very last minute of this video, is this: when the truth finally came out, and it did come out, what did it reveal about the town itself that was more damning than anything it had ever said about her? Those questions do not have comfortable answers, but they have true ones, and that is what we are here for. Her name was Nora Hayes, and she had come to Harlan Creek the way a lot of people came to small West Texas towns in the 1880s, by necessity, not by choice. She was 22 years old when she arrived with a single trunk, a letter of introduction to the schoolhouse, and a past that she had left behind in a small Louisiana parish with the deliberate care of someone who has decided that forward is the only direction worth traveling. Nora was not beautiful in the way that towns like Harlan Creek rewarded beauty, soft and decorative, and careful not to take up too much room. She was beautiful in the way that made people slightly uncomfortable because it came with intelligence attached. She had dark eyes that noticed everything and a voice that was warm when she chose warmth and precise when precision was what the moment required. She became the Harlan Creek schoolteacher inside of 1 week. Inside of 1 month, every child in that school had a reason to look forward to the morning. Inside of 1 year, their parents had a complicated relationship with a woman they respected and did not entirely know what to do with. For 5 years, everything was fine. And then one winter, something happened that fine could not survive. What happened that winter in Harlan Creek changed Nora Hayes' life in ways she had not chosen and could not undo. And the town's response to it told you everything you needed to know about Harlan Creek that Harlan Creek would never tell you about itself. In the winter of 1883, a man named Douglas Pratt came through Harlan Creek. He was well-dressed and well-spoken, and he had enough money to make people in Harlan Creek feel that his character did not require much further examination. He stayed 3 months. He paid court to Nora Hayes in the way that men who are practiced at paying court do, with flowers and flattery and the careful performance of sincerity. Nora was 27 years old, and she was not naive, but she was human, and she made the mistake that humans make when someone who seems good pays them the kind of attention that loneliness makes feel like love. Douglas Pratt left Harlan Creek in February of 1884. He left quietly and early and without saying goodbye to anyone, including Nora Hayes. And 6 months later, Harlan Creek noticed something about their schoolteacher that small towns notice and rarely forgive. Nora Hayes was going to have a child, and there was no husband. What Harlan Creek did with that information is what towns do when they have decided that judgment is a community activity. They talked. They decided. And the story they built, the one about what kind of woman Nora Hayes must be to have arrived at this situation, was thorough and convincing and almost entirely wrong. Thomas Cole had been in Harlan Creek for 4 years by the time any of this happened. He ran cattle on a modest spread on the northern edge of town, and he was the kind of man that Harlan Creek understood without difficulty: quiet, reliable, honest in his dealings, dangerous only when danger was genuinely required. He was 31 years old, and he had a reputation for being fair that was worth considerably more in that part of Texas than a reputation for being charming. Thomas Cole had watched what Harlan Creek did to Nora Hayes from a careful distance, and he had found it the most revealing thing he had ever watched a community do. Not because he was a reformer or a philosopher, but because he had grown up with a mother who had been treated by a small town the same way for different reasons, and he recognized the machinery of it with the intimate familiarity of someone who had watched it run before. He did not approach Nora Hayes immediately. He was not that kind of man. He observed. He considered. He watched her walk down that main street with her chin up for 3 years before he ever said more than good morning to her. And what he saw in those 3 years built something inside him that was quiet and certain and patient in the way that only real things are patient. The child was born in September of 1884. Nora named her Grace. She was a small, serious baby who became a small, serious little girl with her mother's dark eyes and her mother's habit of noticing everything. Nora raised her alone in the White House on Sycamore Road, and she raised her well in the way that women who have decided to be enough raise their children, with books and warmth and the absolute refusal to let the world's opinion of her mother become Grace's opinion of herself. Grace grew up knowing that her mother was the finest person in Harlan Creek. She also grew up knowing that Harlan Creek did not agree. Children know these things. They absorb them through the walls. In the spring of 1891, Thomas Cole did something that Harlan Creek noticed immediately. He started stopping by the schoolhouse after hours. Not to court Nora Hayes in any visible way that the town could point to directly. He came with a broken fence rail that he said he needed help measuring. He came with a question about Grace's reading that he said a neighbor had asked him to pass along. He came with increasingly transparent reasons that fooled nobody, including Nora Hayes, who was not a woman who missed things. What those visits were, stripped of their pretexts, was two people recognizing each other across a distance they had both been keeping out of different kinds of caution. Nora had learned 7 years earlier what happened when she trusted a man's performance of sincerity. Thomas had learned something harder and earlier, and he was in no hurry to perform anything. What they built in those after-hours conversations in the doorway of the Harlan Creek schoolhouse was not romantic in any way the town could easily criticize. It was something quieter and more durable than romance. It was understanding. Harlan Creek noticed Thomas Cole's visits the way it noticed everything. Thoroughly, and with an editorial position already formed before the facts were fully in. The women who had spent 7 years being careful about Nora Hayes began being careful about Thomas Cole. The men who respected Thomas Cole began wondering aloud whether his judgment had perhaps suffered some kind of deterioration. And the collective opinion of Harlan Creek began to do what collective opinions do when they feel themselves about to be contradicted. It got louder. There were conversations in the feed store. There were conversations after Sunday service. There was a delegation of 3 of the town's most prominent women who came to Thomas Cole's ranch on a Tuesday afternoon with a plate of cornbread and a carefully prepared argument for why a man of his standing should consider his associations more carefully. Thomas Cole thanked them for the cornbread. He did not change his associations. By the winter of 1893, it was clear to anyone paying attention that Thomas Cole had made a decision about Nora Hayes that Harlan Creek was not going to be able to talk him out of. What was not clear was what he was going to do about it, or when. Nora herself did not know. They had never spoken directly about the future. They had spoken about everything else: books and grace and cattle and the nature of justice and what it meant to build something in a place that was not entirely sure it wanted you there. But not the future. Not directly. And then something happened in February of 1894 that forced the future to arrive ahead of schedule. What arrived in Harlan Creek that February morning would give Thomas Cole exactly 1 week to make the most important decision of his life. And the decision he made, in front of every person in that town, would change what Harlan Creek was for a generation. In February of 1894, Douglas Pratt rode back into Harlan Creek. He was better dressed than before, and he had a lawyer with him, and he had a piece of paper that he believed gave him the right to do something that Nora Hayes had spent 10 years making sure could never happen. He wanted Grace. Not because he loved her. Not because he had spent a single day of the last 10 years thinking about her welfare. But because Douglas Pratt had recently inherited a considerable sum of money from an uncle in Georgia, and the terms of that inheritance required him to produce an heir. And Grace Hayes, the daughter he had never acknowledged, never supported, never once written a letter to, was the most convenient solution to that requirement that his lawyer had been able to identify. He went to the town magistrate first. He presented his papers. He spoke in the calm, reasonable voice of a man who has money and a lawyer and has therefore never had much reason to develop any other kind of persuasion. The magistrate, a man named Harold Birch who had been one of the louder voices in the 7-year conversation about Nora Hayes' character, listened carefully. And then he did something that should have been impossible. He gave Douglas Pratt 3 days to make his case before a town hearing. Nora Hayes received the notice on a Thursday morning. She read it at her kitchen table with Grace sitting across from her eating oatmeal, and she did not let a single thing she was feeling cross her face, because Grace was 10 years old, and there are things you do not hand to a 10-year-old over breakfast. The 3 days between the notice and the hearing were the longest 3 days Harlan Creek had experienced in recent memory. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone shared it. Douglas Pratt was visible around town during those 3 days in the way that men who have lawyers tend to be visible, confidently, with the quiet assurance of someone who has already calculated the outcome. He had several conversations with prominent townspeople. He bought rounds at the saloon. He was, by every social measurement Harlan Creek used, making a very strong case. Nora Hayes did not make a case. She did not visit anyone. She did not lobby or argue or present her position to the court of town opinion. She went to school each morning and taught her students, and came home each evening and sat with Grace and read to her from the books they were working through together, and she did not tell Grace what was happening because she had not yet found the words that were both true and survivable. Thomas Cole spent those 3 days doing something that nobody in Harlan Creek knew about until much later. He was writing letters. Long, careful letters to people in Louisiana and Georgia and 2 counties over in Texas. And what came back to him by the end of the second day was information that reframed every single thing that Harlan Creek believed it knew about Douglas Pratt, and about the winter of 1883, and about the story it had spent 11 years telling about Nora Hayes. What Thomas Cole found in those letters was not just the truth about Douglas Pratt. It was the truth about Harlan Creek itself. And he was going to walk into that meeting room on Sunday morning, and he was going to say it out loud whether the town was ready to hear it or not. The Harlan Creek town meeting on that Sunday morning in March of 1894 was the most attended gathering in the town's history. People came who had never attended a town meeting before. People came from ranches 2 hours away who had heard about the hearing through the particular telegraph that small Texas towns use when something genuinely consequential is about to happen. Douglas Pratt sat at the front of the room with his lawyer beside him. Nora Hayes sat on the far side with Grace's hand in hers, and her chin at the exact angle it had been at for 11 years. Harold Birch called the meeting to order. Douglas Pratt spoke first. He was smooth and measured, and he used words like natural right and paternal duty and the child's future with the practiced ease of a man who has paid someone to arrange them in the most persuasive possible order. Several people in the room were nodding. It was going the way things in Harlan Creek usually went. And then Harold Birch asked if anyone had anything to say before he called for a decision. Thomas Cole stood up. He did not stand up dramatically. He was not a dramatic man. He stood up the way he did everything, quietly, completely, with the full weight of his intention behind it. And then he placed on Harold Birch's table the letters he had spent 3 days gathering. And he told that room what those letters contained. He told them that Douglas Pratt had done what he did to Nora Hayes deliberately and with calculation. That he had a pattern across 3 states of courting women of independent means and leaving them in circumstances that destroyed their reputations and their livelihoods while he moved on untouched. He told them that 2 of those women had tried to bring cases against Douglas Pratt, and that Douglas Pratt's money had made those cases disappear. He told them that Nora Hayes had not made a poor judgment. She had been targeted by a practiced predator and then punished for it by a town that had chosen the predator's version of events because the predator was well-dressed and she was alone. He told them all of this in a voice that did not rise once above its normal register. And then he said, I have one more thing to say. He looked at Nora Hayes across that room, and he said, I will marry her. Today, if she will have me. Not because she needs rescuing. She has never needed rescuing. But because she deserves to have one person in this room stand up and say clearly and in front of everyone that she is the finest person in Harlan Creek and that this town owes her 11 years of an apology it will spend the rest of its life figuring out how to make. The room was silent for a very long time. Then Grace Hayes, 10 years old, her mother's dark eyes, her mother's habit of noticing everything, stood up beside her mother and said in a clear, steady voice, I think she should say yes. Nora Hayes looked at Thomas Cole across that room for a moment that everyone present described differently afterward, depending on what they needed the moment to mean. Then she said, yes, quietly, like a woman who has been carrying something alone for 11 years and has finally decided that putting it down is not weakness. It is just time. Douglas Pratt left Harlan Creek that afternoon with his lawyer and his papers, and the particular silence of a man who has walked into a room expecting one outcome and encountered something he had no legal instrument to counter. The truth, told plainly, by someone with nothing to gain from telling it except the satisfaction of having done so. Harold Birch resigned as town magistrate 6 months later. He did not give a public reason. Those who knew him said he had done a lot of thinking about the 11 years and had arrived at conclusions that a man of conscience could not comfortably hold a position of authority alongside. Thomas Cole and Nora Hayes were married that same Sunday afternoon by the circuit preacher who happened to be in Harlan Creek that week. Grace stood beside her mother. The schoolhouse was full by evening with people who came, some out of genuine celebration and some out of a guilt that they were only beginning to understand the shape of. Both kinds were welcome. Nora Hayes was not a woman who kept score. She taught at the Harlan Creek schoolhouse for another 22 years. She was, by the end of those years, the most respected person in the town. Not because the town had changed entirely. Towns rarely do. But because enough people had been in that room on that Sunday morning and had heard the truth told out loud and had found that they could not unhear it. And that is sometimes how change works. Not all at once. Not cleanly. But in the slow reckoning of people who have been forced to see something they would have preferred not to and have discovered that they cannot look away. The last thing Grace Hayes Cole ever said publicly about her mother, at a gathering honoring Nora's retirement from the schoolhouse in 1916, was this. She said that her mother had taught her many things over many years, but the most important one she had taught her without words. She taught her by the way she walked down that main street every morning for 11 years with her chin up and her eyes forward and not 1 ounce of the town's opinion of her in her posture. She taught her that a woman who knows her own worth does not require a town's permission to carry it. You carry it yourself, every single day, until the day the truth catches up with the story. And it always does. It just sometimes takes 11 years and a cowboy with a stack of letters and 5 words said quietly in a full room. But it catches up. This has been just one more story.